So welcome everyone to our second ever Second Harvest Investor Call. I am so thrilled to have you all here today. I'm Suzanne Willis. I'm the Chief Development Officer here at Second Harvest, and my colleague Sierra Top, who is our Donor Relations Manager, is joining me today and hosting you. I know that Willie has joined the audience as well, so when we get to some question time, if there's something that you're stumping us with, Willie is here and can always answer those questions also. I would like to introduce you today to our guest speaker, David Amaral. David is a Second Harvest trustee. He's a PhD candidate at UC Santa Cruz, and he's a fellow at the Blum Center on Poverty, Social Enterprise, and Participatory Governance. David has a Master's of Political Science from the University of Illinois, Chicago, and completed his undergraduate work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Some of his honors and recognitions are the Chancellor's Dissertation Fellowship awarded this year, and a grant from the Horowitz Foundation for Social Policy. Before working towards his PhD, David had a distinguished career in Chicago as a playwright and director, as well as managing the educational programming for a regional theater. Today, David is joining us to give us some hot off the presses insight into the hunger into Santa Cruz County. But before we start, I just want to do a little housekeeping. We are recording this presentation. Everyone will be muted during the presentation. And if you'd like to ask questions, please feel free to do so using the chat feature. So you can type your questions in. Sierra and I will be monitoring those, and David will be able to respond to those questions at the end of his presentation. So thank you for joining us today, and welcome, David. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Suzanne, for that very generous introduction. And of course, to all the folks at Second Harvest for the crucial work you do every day. I'm really pleased to be here to share some work we have been doing at the Blum Center on Poverty, Social Enterprise, and Participatory Governance at UC Santa Cruz. And so I'll be presenting research from a report that we've just recently put out. But before I share that, I want to give just a little bit of background on the project. So in 2019, the Blum Center collaborated with Second Harvest to develop what we call the Food Insecurity Index for Santa Cruz County. And the goal behind this was to come up with a better way to measure and track food insecurity in our county, and to be able to assess how much of the need for assistance was being met, both by the food bank and its nonprofit partners, but also through governmental programs like CalFresh or school lunches, for example. And I am glad to go into the weeds if people want to get into the details about how this is actually constructed, but essentially it boils down to this. Next slide, please. So using publicly available data from the census, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, from state assistance agencies, we estimate the population at risk of food insecurity in the county. And we peg the threshold as households earning below $75,000 per year. We then figure out how many meals this group needs for everyone in it to have 3 meals a day. And we estimate both how many meals this group is able to purchase for itself and how many meals are provided through all forms of local food assistance efforts. And then we were able to estimate how many of those meals that this population at risk needed went missing over the course of the year. So that's sort of a down and dirty overview of how the index works. But since we rely on a lot of data from governmental agencies, our index is essentially what you might think of as a lagging indicator. We're usually about a year behind because we have to wait for official statistics to be published. So the data I'll be presenting first only goes up through 2019. And so you can imagine that as we were working on this over the last year during the COVID pandemic, we were thinking, well, these estimates are missing a lot of what we think is probably going on right now on the ground. So this year, we've complemented the index estimates with data that we gathered by interviewing leaders and volunteers for food assistance from food assistance organizations throughout the county. We talked to them to get a more current, more on the ground level perspective of food insecurity during the early months of the pandemic, a perspective that wouldn't otherwise have been present in our estimates. So that's what I'll be sharing. First, the index estimates up through 2019, which really should be thought of as sort of a snapshot of what was happening in the county in the year leading up to COVID. And then I'll share some of the key themes that emerged from the interviews with the food assistance providers. So to begin, what do the estimates tell us about food insecurity in Santa Cruz County in the year leading up to COVID? Next slide, please. So approximately a third of households in the county were at risk of food insecurity. Now I'll note right away that that is a percentage that is notably higher than survey-based estimates for the country as a whole, but it is in line with other related poverty estimates that have been conducted for the region. And especially when we consider that housing prices and rental prices in the Santa Cruz, Watsonville metropolitan statistical area were nearly 75% above the national average. We're confident that this estimate is on target. On average, this group was able to purchase about 54% of the meals they needed. An additional 22% of those meals were provided through food assistance efforts. Next slide, please. So here's a breakdown of the food assistance provided over that year. You can see that CalFresh was the largest single source, responsible for about 42% of all assistance meals provided. CalFresh, as a reminder, is California's version of the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP, what we used to refer to as food stamps. And roughly 64% of all food assistance meals were provided through some form of governmental assistance program. Now that means that the food bank and its nonprofit partners provided nearly 36% of all food assistance meals over the course of the year. Next slide. But despite roughly 22 million meals being provided through food assistance efforts, there were 24 million missing meals remaining. Now, we know that food insecurity is experienced in different ways by different households. In one household, family members may skip meals. In another, the parents are reducing portions to ensure that kids get enough. Perhaps a family is buying, high-calorie groceries because they're cheaper than fresh produce. Whatever form it takes, the index makes pretty clear that despite really important and essential food assistance efforts, there remained considerable need in the county even before COVID and the economic and unemployment shocks that it brought with it. Next slide, please. So I also want to make sure that we point out that even within our county, there is food insecurity is unevenly distributed. So I'm going to show you a series of maps to convey a sense of how food insecurity may be distributed unevenly within the county. Next slide, please. So this is a map showing the percentage of households with income below 200% of the federal poverty level. This is by census tract. So this statistic is one key indicator for whether or not a household qualifies for CalFresh, for example. Next slide. This map shows what we sometimes refer to as the SNAP gap. So what it's showing is the difference between the percentage of households who likely qualify for CalFresh and the percentage of households who report actually participating in the program. So essentially what that tells us is that there are certain pockets in Watsonville, in the San Lorenzo Valley, in certain tracts near downtown Santa Cruz, where the need for assistance is not as fully being met by the major governmental food assistance program. Next slide. So keeping that in mind, here's a map of the geographic distribution of food assistance by Second Harvest and its nonprofit partners. Now, this is not quite as fine-grained as the census data, but it does indicate that a majority of the food assistance being distributed by the food bank and its partners is being directed to areas where CalFresh is leaving the largest meal gap. And it's worth noting that, and this is a point I'll come back to towards the end, but even within the county, there are residents who don't qualify for governmental assistance, right? And so the nonprofit sector has a particularly important role in addressing food insecurity for those groups. Next slide. Over the last 5 years, we estimate that food insecurity has been decreasing in the county. there have been generally fewer meals missed by county residents over this time. But it's important to dig down a little bit further to try to figure out why this is happening. And what we see is that our population at risk is shrinking. The number of households earning under $75,000 has decreased by nearly 25% over these years, just a handful of years. While food assistance distributed in the county has remained relatively stable. So it's not declining as quickly as the population at risk is. So as the need decreases faster than food assistance, that means that the assistance is able to cover more of that meal gap. Now we think that it's likely that many of these households are being pushed out of the county by rapidly rising housing costs. Not only are rental prices in the county among the most expensive in the country, but they have also increased essentially 20% over the 4 years between 2015 and 2019. So that's rapidly rising rental costs. We can also think about it in terms of how much of a household's income is going to housing. When a household spends more than 30% of its income on housing, generally referred to that household as rent burdened. And in 2019, if we look just at the households at sort of the top bracket of our population at risk, those are the households earning between $50,000 and $75,000 a year. 61% of them are rent burdened. Now that's higher than the rate for the state of California, which is at about 50%. It's also far above the national average for that group, which is 24%. Next slide, please. So those are our findings from the Food Insecurity Index for 2019. But again, we know that the country, the world, and our county have been changed dramatically since the pandemic struck and by the economic shocks that it brought with it. And even though the data we generally work with to develop the index aren't yet available, there are some early indicators of just how much the pandemic impacted local food insecurity levels. So next slide, please. So this figure shows monthly unemployment in the county from 2014 through October of 2020. And many of us probably heard about this or remember it, but unemployment in the county jumped to 17% in April of 2020, and it stayed above 10% through July. Now, there is research out there, research that has developed models that essentially indicate that shifts in unemployment can predict about half of the change in food insecurity. So it's the largest single indicator. And that's one piece of statistical evidence hinting at the dramatic increase of food insecurity experienced in our county in the early months of the pandemic. Next slide. We can also look at the value of CalFresh distributed in the county. When the assistance peaked, the CalFresh assistance peaked in June of 2020. The program was issuing $2.1 million more per month than it had 4 months earlier. The number of households also increased by 3,000 between February and June of that year. Next slide. We can also look at how many pounds of food Second Harvest and its partner agencies were distributing. So the total pounds of food distributed rose from roughly 640,000 pounds in February of 2020 to over 1.2 million pounds in April of that year. So all indications are that both need and assistance rose dramatically in the early months of the pandemic. But that really only captures part of the picture, part of what it actually meant to be on the ground working to address food insecurity in the county. Next slide. So in our interviews, we spoke with organizational leaders and volunteers who were doing this important work on the ground. And we asked them to share their perspectives on 4 main topics. Need. How many more people were showing up? Were these the same people or were they new people? Challenges. How did the level of need, but also the challenges imposed by the public health mandates impact the work that they were doing? Strategies. What did these organizations do in response to those heightened challenges that they faced? And then opportunities. And this was admittedly an optimistic line of questioning on my part, But we were interested to hear if the pandemic had opened up any new opportunities for these groups and the work that they did. Next slide, please. So I'll run through them and share the themes that emerged from the interviews. For need, nearly all of the agencies reported significant increases in need, ranging from 20% to 400% in the early months of the pandemic. And what that meant was that these organizations were serving between 30 and 3,000 more households per week. They also reported seeing a lot of new faces. There were a lot of folks who started showing up to the food distribution sites who said they'd never taken part in food assistance before, if anything, that they had donated. There were also reports of increased attendance by professional and middle-class families, as well as a particularly notable increase in participation by service workers, people who worked in restaurants, childcare, hospitality industry workers in general. Next slide. So maintaining social distancing, ensuring people had masks, and et cetera, it posed some initial challenges, but the organizations we spoke to were able to figure it out pretty quickly. What turned out to be tough actually had more to do with people. So many of the volunteers who had worked at the distribution sites prior to COVID were seniors or people who often had underlying health vulnerabilities. And so this reduced staffing dramatically. And often these folks actually wanted to keep volunteering, but it was the organizational leaders themselves who had to step in and say, look, out of an abundance of caution, we need you to stay home. And that was tough because that really increased the stress on the already overworked organizational staff. The other challenge that I heard repeatedly, and I didn't quite expect, was how the pandemic really reduced what one person referred to as the social rewards of food assistance work. So the staff and volunteers weren't able to, check in with the attendees who they developed relationships with. And similarly for those attending, the social engagement, the opportunity for community and connection just wasn't there. It wasn't possible. And those were really important parts of this community-based food distribution. These are social events. And so it tells us that food distribution sites are social and personal events. They provide social and personal nourishment and not just food. And that was an important challenge to uncover during the pandemic. Next slide, please. So nearly all of the organizations we talked to shifted to some sort of a drive-through model. This allowed them to ensure social distancing, but also let them be far more efficient, allowing them to serve dramatically more people showing up for assistance in a shorter time frame. And beyond that, distribution events became opportunities for public education and sharing other resources. They distributed masks and sanitizer. Many also shared information about rental assistance. There were new partnerships forged between nonprofit groups to increase food assistance delivery, for example. And it was pretty clear that the food assistance response during the pandemic, both relied upon and really helped forge this network of nonprofits that proved to be pretty nimble and collaborative in addressing the challenges we faced. Next slide, please. And much to my delight, many of those I interviewed acknowledged opportunities created by the pandemic. Some said that they had learned more about the communities they served, that they gained new knowledge about unmet need. Others noted developing a stronger, more trusting relationships with the communities that they served. But probably the most important opportunity that came out of COVID was the increased public awareness. This is something came up in multiple interviews. So, food insecurity has been prevalent, even by what I consider as pretty conservative estimate for decades. And we really only talk about it in any sort of focused way in moments of crisis. And the pandemic hits, and all of a sudden there are these major news stories in the New York Times about food insecurity. And it's in the public conversation, and not just food insecurity in general, but also how it disproportionately burdens communities of color and households with children. And so something I heard from many people I interviewed was that this increased awareness proved to be a major opportunity to address one of the most pernicious problems of food insecurity in the country, and that's the problem of stigma. There are such ingrained stigmas against participating in any sort of food assistance program. And because of the pandemic, there are thousands upon thousands of new people participating, showing up at the county food fairgrounds and distribution sites all over the county, and they're seeing their neighbors there. There was a lot of hope that the pandemic would help chip away at some of that ingrained stigma and hopefully make people more willing to both support and to participate in food assistance in the future. Next slide, please. Last slide. So just to sort of sum up and tease out some important takeaways. In the year leading up to COVID, there was significant and unmet need for food assistance in the county. CalFresh and other governmental programs play a huge role in addressing some of that need. And so increasing enrollment in CalFresh could take us a long way. There are estimates that if we enrolled everyone who was eligible to participate in CalFresh, it would bring in an additional $14.9 million into the county. So that would be good. But governmental assistance only goes so far. There are many people who experience food insecurity in the county, but who are either ineligible or unwilling to accept that governmental assistance. So the food bank and its community partners play a vital role in closing the meal gap in Santa Cruz County and have a relationship that has proved particularly nimble and essential during the pandemic. Together, these groups form a network that is cultivating close and trusting relationships with communities across the country, with groups that are often hard to reach. And through that collaboration, they're playing a crucial role in alleviating food insecurity experienced by our neighbors throughout the county. So I will stop there. I am glad to hear any questions or comments that you may have. Our work is constantly improved by the feedback we receive, so I am always eager to hear it. Thank you.
Thanks. Excuse me, we did get one question here. I did not realize that Second Harvest is supplying almost as much food as CalFresh to meet the need in our community. Is the percentage of food provided by the food bank to the population that is food insecure especially high in our county as compared to other counties? That's actually something that Willie might be able to answer better than you or me, David. Willie, are you still around? Can you take that one?
Sure am. Yeah, and so nationally, the food banks provide, typically about 1/7 the amount of food that is provided by CalFresh, and in this community, there's just such extraordinary support from the community and such an extraordinary network of partner agencies that we actually provide a much higher level of service than you see in other communities. So First Food Bank in California, we're pretty special.
If there are any other questions, feel free to enter them into the chat box. To find the chat box, if you're unfamiliar, if you just hover over the very bottom portion of your Zoom screen, there's a little icon that says chat. Another question came in. I hope this report can be made available on the website. It would be a great tool to show potential donors the great need we have in this county to address food insecurity. I can answer that. We will be sending this out to all of you, our participants, and it will be available on our site, and we'll link back to the Blum Center where the report originates from. So yes, it's definitely out there. One more question that came in. What are the obstacles to getting folks to sign up for CalFresh to recoup that $14.9 million? David, do you have any insight into that one?
I have a little bit, and I'm sure Willie has additional insights. Well, so stigma is clearly one of them, I think, the stigmatization of any sort of assistance in the country. I think it varies a lot by different populations and groups. And so one thing that really struck a chord when we published our first report and received feedback was that even families that may be eligible, so this is sort of, undocumented immigrants are ineligible. But if families have children who were born here, they're eligible. One of the troubles, especially over the recent years, was there was discussion by the Trump administration to make receipt of CalFresh or Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program a potential barrier to receiving permanent residence. And even though that never went through, there was such sort of a fear among communities that they became reluctant for a variety of reasons and sort of skeptical of governmental assistance programs. So those are two. I'm sure there are as many as there are different communities that are reluctant to take advantage of it.
Mhm. Willie, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think David summed up pretty well. It's just the anxiety, and and so many people not realizing that they're eligible and that there's stigma in not really thinking about the fact that not only are they creating a healthier future for their kids, but they're also creating a healthier and stronger economy by creating those jobs in the community, because people are buying more food through the grocery stores and the farmers markets.
Mm-hmm.
On that last
Absolutely.
point, there's research that shows that for every dollar of federal food assistance dollars that come in, it actually benefits the local community. But I think $1.79 was the estimate. So it actually has this multiplier effect where it's really good for the local economy.
Suzanne, may I interject something?
Mm-hmm.
Well, when I started with the board on Second Harvest, and I'm only saying this because I hoped that Willie might have bragged a little bit, but it's not his style, so I'm going to brag for him. Santa Cruz was one of the worst performing counties in the state, and over the last 6 years, Willie and his team have partnered with the county in really effective ways, and we've moved up like 25 states. So instead of being 53rd out of 58th, we're really in the middle of the pack, and that has not been easy. It's been really hard work, and I just really want to call out Willie and the staff for making that a priority, because it is essential in meeting this meal gap.
Yeah, thanks, Tricia. David, I have one more question for you here. What was the most surprising statistic or trend that you found when conducting the study?
So it was a trend, I guess. It was how, it was only when I started talking to all of these different agencies that were, in some way connected to the food bank, that I realized how diverse they were and how ingrained in different parts of the community they were. I mean, I talked to groups that focused addressing need among unsheltered homelessness, farm workers. There were so many different populations that they had developed these really close and trusting relationships with, and that, I mean, it was through that network that they are all out there developing these relationships with parts of the community, and then they're all connected back to the food bank. It sort of enables, the food bank to reach out to more people and for them all to be connected to all of the assistance that the food bank brings in. So that's what stood out to me, just this diversity of organizations and focuses and how they were all connected in this interconnected web.
Thank you. Karen McCarty writes that she's sure that the fear of being taken away for the undocumented parents has to be a big reason for not seeking assistance. And I think we really saw that highlighted very heavily during the previous administration with family separations, which has been something that is not new to that administration. So, you're dealing with a population that is very concerned about government knowledge of whether your kids are here legally or not, if you have a blended family like that. I agree, Karen. Oh, one last question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Sierra. But David, can you please clarify what missing meals means again for us?
Yeah, sure. So we start off, just to remind us, we estimate this population at risk, and then figure out how many meals they need to have a basic diet, just 3 meals a day at sort of this basic county adjusted meal price. And it's just, 3 meals a day every day of the year. We draw on data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics that tells us roughly how much different income groups spend on food, and that helps us figure out how many meals they're purchasing. Then we figure out how many meals are being distributed through the assistance efforts of the food bank and of CalFresh and all the different groups. And that's So the gap between how many meals people can buy and how many are being provided through assistance efforts, between that and how many meals they need for, you know, a basic diet, that's the meal gap. Hopefully that made sense.
Hopefully it makes sense. So if a family of 4 wants to eat 3 meals a day, they're looking at 12 meals each day, and they might only be able to afford to buy 2 of them and get 2 more of them from the food bank, and then the other portion of them are just missing, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're doing it sort of as a
Yeah.
aggregate number, but you know, considering all the different household sizes and everything, but yes, we're looking
Exactly.
at sort of the county level of that.
Well, we have gone over time, but this is such a fascinating conversation. If people would like to stick around, we can answer some more questions. But I would like to turn it over to Sierra to sort of wrap things up for us. If you'd like to stick around, we've got a couple more questions that are here, and we can cover those. But let's set people free to go off and do what they need to do this evening if we need to.
Okay, so thank you, David, for taking the time to present today, and thank you for everyone for joining and staying over a few minutes. I just wanted to share the next steps. So we will be sending out an email with resources, and that will include the new Blum report, the slides that we used today, and the recording from today's call. And then our next investor call will be sometime in October, so keep an eye out for that. And then lastly, we are so excited to announce that our chef's dinner will be in person this year on Thursday, September 9th at Holy Cross Church. So we had to do a virtual celebration last year, and we are really excited to celebrate with you all in person this year. So we will be getting invitations for that out next week as well. So keep an eye out for those. And then all my contact information is on the bottom of this slide. So if you have any further questions about the investor call or chefs or anything, please feel free to reach out. And I will stop there. And then if anyone has additional questions, or if not, have a wonderful night. And thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everybody. So those who are sticking around, we still have quite a few people on here. Willie, are you still here?
Yes.
Oh, there's Willie. I see him.
Yeah, I am for a few more minutes. Yeah.
Just another minute. A question came in. What outreach efforts is Second Harvest taking to help folks understand and apply for CalFresh? Do you want to take that one?
Yeah. No, we have just an amazing team, you know, that is really good. You know, they go out to the food pantries, to the food distributions. You know, we push the information out through radio, through social media. You know, we've had a number of articles, you know, in the Sentinel, you know, over this last period here, you know, so just really trying to educate. And as always, we really work through trusted partners, you know, so, you know, I see Melissa Watley was on the call earlier. We have a great partnership with UCSC. There are a lot of students at UCSC and Cabrillo who are eligible. So really working hard to reach out to those students who are trying to move forward in their lives. But the main thing is, you know, the team is awesome. They're very friendly, and it's like concierge. They really make it easy so that, you know, some people find sometimes the process can be a little intimidating, and we make it really easy for people. So.
Agreed. David, one more for you, and then I think we're done with our questions. But did you assess the impact for children who were getting meals at school but lost that because of schools being closed?
So we will. That should be part of the next revision and update to our index, because that occurred. Our index isn't quite up there yet, but we will be looking at when we update it for the next time, and that'll play probably a significant role in shaping how the what the index estimates.
Yeah, and I do know that our school partners really worked hard to try and make sure that those kids were still getting meals, and they were partnering, getting food from us as well as food from the school system itself. So I think that'll be an interesting statistic that you get to maybe highlight in the next report as it comes out.
Hey, can I do one real quick build? So, and the report after that will be very exciting, because one of the things that happened in the state budget is There's funding to provide free meals for all kids that go to school, breakfast and lunch. So there again, one of the big issues with school nutrition is stigma. You know, the poor kids get it, and you know, the middle class kids don't. And so, you know, every kid who goes to school, the fact that you've gone to school means you're entitled to a good, healthy meal. That's going to be transformational. And I'm very, very excited that we were able to get that approved, you know, in the state budget that was signed last week, and start rolling that out. Because quite frankly, people may have heard me say this before, but there's nothing that can make a bigger impact on the future of our community than making sure that every kid has healthy meals every day they go to school. So I'm excited about not only next year's report, but even more about the year after.
Excellent. Well, that's it on the questions. Thank you, everybody. We still have a couple people left, but I just want to thank you, David, for presenting this information. Like I said, it's hot off the presses. We just got the report last week, so we're so thrilled to be able to share that with you. We'll be sending out an email with that. It'll be on our site. It's definitely at the Blum Center's site, so you can find that kind of in many locations. Thank you all, and we'll see you at our next investor call.